Hey, Professor Visser, this is Nolan Pappas here. In the module, you said to just state who's speaking. I'd just like to let you know that this whole presentation is being done by just me. I had a little trouble finding a group, so get going with this. So basically, after watching that 45-minute keynote talk from the SITE 2018 conference, SITE standing for Society for Information Technology and Teacher Education, this video delivered by Richard Coletta. The one section that specifically stood out to me was the second one, which dealt with thinking in code. I had a personal draw to it just because of my computer science background, but let's get going. All right, so what exactly does thinking code mean? Coding definitely has a negative connotation to it, and honestly, it's misperceived as well. So when people hear coding, they immediately think computer science and almost like this nerd working behind a desk his whole life programming computers and other devices. But no, that's totally wrong. Coding is something much more generic and it has much more uses. For example, like coding can be literally a thought process. It could be a new way of thinking about things. It's the act of coding that teaches you that way, but coding can be done in everyday scenarios, mainly with problem solving, but it's just an alternative, outside the box, new way of thinking that actually takes you away from the generic mold of most humans. So I pulled out some cool coding quotes that actually I think resonate with me and I could learn a lot from them. So the first one by Muhammad Wasim, he says, "Give a man a program, frustrate him for a day. Teach a man a program, frustrate him for a lifetime." What this is basically saying is once you learn the thought process behind coding in your head, you'll never forget it. It stays with you forever. This program is the thought of coding, and it's a new way about thinking about things, and you'll become such a smarter and effective learner and thinker because of it. The second quote by Chris Pine says, "Programming isn't about what you know, it's about what you can figure out." And that's the whole thing behind it. It's not about coding isn't about programming, it's just about figuring things out and a new way about thinking about things. All right, so I felt this was necessary to include just personal anecdote because I was briefly a computer science major here and ultimately made the decision to leave the major. So just want to say I think a large part or reason was that because I had no prior knowledge in computer science before coming to Clemson, and a lot of my classmates have been doing it their whole lifetime, or they had parents in the business, so on and so forth. But what I really think is it just shows how important it is to learn from a young age because it just opens up so many more avenues, and it's just really important to know how to think that way. And I think being 19, learning computer science for the first time, ultimately really was detrimental to me and my learning experience. Just some basic principles of coding that honestly I think our teacher even passed over, assuming people knew. I wasn't even aware about yet. So I think it's very important that everyone learns this at a young age while their brain's still learning, because it will honestly stick with you, first of all, and two, it will just help change the way you think about things while your brain's still developing, rather than me already an adult. So I also want to include some examples about coding because I think everyone thinks it's just working behind a desk. It's basically just coding is a series of inputs and outputs. It's very ambiguous. It could, just for example, like if you want to use it in a classroom, you can have students get in a circle like you're playing Duck Duck Dukes and hand every kid a flashcard that has an action on it. So just like run, jump, step left, step right. And basically you have one kid stand in the middle and he can go to one person, take the action card, read it, and perform that act. And this is basically what's done in computer science. You give a code into the computer and it generates outward. All right. So this was also the other example on the previous page mentioned students organizing themselves into a number order. This is a way of sorting and it's done in algorithms with computer science. So basically, I don't want to harp on this too much. There's a microwave coding example here too, which basically just shows how by pressing numbers into a microwave, you get a certain output. And the whole thought process behind all this is just that coding's done in the real world and you can literally find it anywhere. All right, so why is coding important in today's world? Well, we want to build the next young leaders in this world, and how can we make them better and different from us is by teaching them things that a lot of our generation wasn't exposed to, and I think that is computer science and more particularly coding. So I think by doing that at a young age, it will just help move the rest of the world in the right direction, and we'll have a lot of new inventions and products and great people because of it. And I also think it's much more relevant today just because of the impact of the digital age and the use of technology and the boom because of it. And lastly, like it's also important because some you can kind of start to see it some places just problem solving it's just not as effective as it should be. Some people just very easily make decisions with not a lot of reasoning behind it, and coding helps discover that reasoning for you and delve into the larger issues. So how does coding tie into education, you ask? Well, honestly, the two are intertwined completely. Um, that's where you're going to learn to code through education. In a classroom, I think it's really important that all schools across America start teaching coding. And I just want to this is a misconception. Teaching coding doesn't mean you have to be a computer science major. It's not about being that. And yes, there are plenty, it's a growing market field and there are plenty of jobs opened up for computer science at high wages. And that's great. Some people will want to do that, but it's so much more deeper and important than that. It's just about the thought process of learning, and it's about reprogramming the brain to think differently. And also, another misconception is you have to be a computer science teacher to actually teach computer science or coding. But that's not necessarily true. Anyone can teach coding because, as shown in the previous examples with the microwave and the Duck Duck Goose class and the ordering, it can just be done in life examples. It doesn't actually need to be through a computer typing out code. All right, so how does coding fit into the ISTE standards for educators? I'm just going to go ahead real quick. So what is ISTE standards for educators? Well, it's basically a roadmap for helping students become empowered learners. This includes, there's 7 different standards, if you want to say. Learner, leader, citizen, collaborator, designer, facilitator, and analyst. I would take you through each of them, but I think they're pretty self-explanatory. So just ones in particular that stood out to me when dealing with coding. Obviously, the first one is learn. Students, and more importantly, teachers need to learn how to code or just how to teach coding. Secondly, leaders. Coding will produce leaders, I guarantee it. Mark Zuckerberg, some of the biggest names in the world are all products of a computer science background. But I don't want to say that it's because of computer science, it's because they were taught how to think in the coding manner. And we need leaders like teachers to be able to teach these to students, and then because of it, these students will grow into leaders of their own. Then they can pass it down the information themselves. Another one I found very important was a designer, because that's what coding is. It's designing and thinking about new ways to create products, inventions, tools, gadgets, and it just opens your brain up, parts of your brain that you aren't exposed to if you don't use computer science. And then 7, analyst. Students need to understand the connections they are making. A lot about computer science, it's input and outputs, and you need to understand the relationship between the two and how it's configured. Coding isn't just typing out code, but it's about A is a product of B and B produces C. So it's important when you're analyzing coding to understand these connections and these smaller details. And this, when translated to the real world, will help you be more attentive and just recognize smaller details that are important and change decisions drastically. So how does coding influence the business world? Well, in many ways actually, and it's developed much more recently, but new business models, data analytics, and the business sector has been stagnant for a while. So these new young people that come up, if they're able to crack into this market a little more and develop high-tech analytic models that some of the older heads haven't been using or exposed to, it could drastically change the fields. So I definitely think coding hasn't marked as much on the business world. So I'm curious to see, because it's definitely taken a leap in sports, and especially Major League Baseball. The game over the last year, a lot of the teams' thinkings has changed. For example, home runs versus strikeouts. In the last couple of years, every single year, strikeout and home run percentage has gone up. And this is because the thinking by teams, as they've developed analytic departments in their programs, has the new common thought that, oh, a home run, taking risk and getting home run hitters in your team will increase the likelihood that you win the game because all you need is a few home runs to win. Whereas singles and guys that just hit for singles and small bases isn't really helping you score runs. Another example is the fly ball revolution, which is a product of more home runs being hit. That all these players are just working on getting their ball out of the air. They don't want to hit ground balls anymore because if you hit a ground ball, there's no shot it goes out of the stadium. All right, I'm just running around here. I don't want to keep this going too long, so I'm just going a little quick through this. Sabermetrics, it's the same thing. If you can see through this graph right here, teams and data analytic departments in these teams are developing these types of graphs to show their players where to expect pitches and so on and so forth. All right, and just lastly, I would like to talk about some of the summary and main takeaways. Probably the three most important things I want to stress to you is that coding doesn't equate to computer science. There are many uses for coding, so don't let that deter you. Also, teachers, they don't have to be computer science teachers when teaching coding. And lastly, coding is about reprogramming the brain. It's not about developing computers. That is computer science. So thank you for your time, and hopefully you have a good day.